At this point, I'm hoping you feel comfortable with some of the basic concepts and measurements that are often tossed around in discussions of macroeconomics. I'm hoping you feel comfortable with how GDP is measured, and also with the four macroeconomic goals of economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and a sustainable balance of trade. But it is a hard fact that having four separate goals can cause confusion, because it raises a question about whether it's possible to reach all of the goals at roughly the same time, or if there are inevitable trade-offs between the goals. For example, it is impossible to accomplish simultaneously the four goals of being in Los Angeles, London, Beijing, and Rio de Janeiro. But if your four goals are to visit the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the New York Stock Exchange, and a Broadway show, then all four goals can be accomplished with a single trip to New York City. Are the four goals of macroeconomics, economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and a sustainable balance of trade, like trying to visit four completely different cities, in the sense that it's impossible to achieve all four at the same time? Or is it possible for an economy to attain several or all of its macroeconomic goals at more or less the same time? To think about this issue, we need an organizing framework for how to think about the macroeconomy. And the basic framework most commonly used is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So what I want to do in this lecture is to lay out the ideas of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's start with aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is limited by potential GDP, where potential GDP is the amount that the economy can produce if all resources in the economy are fully employed. At potential GDP, cyclical unemployment would be zero, and so any remaining unemployment would be accounted for by the natural rate of unemployment. Sometimes potential GDP is referred to as full employment GDP, because it refers to the notion that everyone is employed and also that the machinery and the capital equipment in the economy is fully employed as well. When we think about the aggregate supply of the economy, that is, the total amount that an economy can produce, it's going to be limited. The most it can do is potential GDP. Now, let's think about why aggregate supply might shift. What will change what an economy is capable of producing? There are really two main reasons. One is technological growth, and the other would be a sharp change in the conditions of production that affected many firms across the economy. So let's think about each of these in turn. The process of productivity growth over time means greater output per hour. In essence, it means the productive potential of an economy is expanding over time. Remember from our earlier lecture that the fundamental determinants of economic growth are increases in human capital, in physical capital, and in technology over time. And with gradual increases in all three of these, you can imagine potential GDP and aggregate supply slowly rising steadily over time. For a high-income country like the U.S., maybe rising 2 or 3% a year. But at certain times, there are going to be sharp changes in the conditions of production, and those might reduce what an economy is able to produce. The classic example here is the sharp increases in oil prices that the U.S. economy experienced in the 1970s. Oil is very widely used in the U.S. economy, and of course energy, including natural gas and other things, are even more widely used. So when the cost of energy rose, it drove up the costs of production for many, many industries all at the same time. This was a negative shock to aggregate supply. And while the economy went through a period of adjustment, a period of transition, for some period of time, the economy was able to produce less than it had been before all the costs of energy rose so dramatically. So, there we've got an idea of aggregate supply. Let's now switch over and think about the idea of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is determined by its 5 components. And as I've said several times now, its components are C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Back in lecture 19, the discussion of what GDP was and how it's measured pointed out that GDP could be measured either by what the economy produced or equivalently by the main sources of demand in the economy. And so in terms of the framework we're using here, you can think of aggregate supply as, of course, what the economy produces, and then you can think of aggregate demand in terms of those main ingredients of aggregate demand that we talked about when we were measuring GDP. Remember that of the components of aggregate demand, consumption is the biggest one, at 2/3 or more of GDP most years. Investment is smaller, but it's the most volatile, bouncing up and down. Government spending is perhaps under the most direct policy control at any given time. And exports and imports, the demand components there, are heavily shaped by what's happening in other countries. But as these factors shift, that is, consumption, investment, government spending on goods and services, and exports and imports, shifts in those factors will lead to corresponding changes in aggregate demand and make it go up or down. Now, for the economy as a whole, the quantity of aggregate supply must equal the quantity of aggregate demand. But there are competing theories of macroeconomics. One theory argues or emphasizes that aggregate supply really creates or drives aggregate demand. The opposing theory puts aggregate demand first and suggests that aggregate demand creates or drives the quantity of aggregate supply. So let's run through these two theories in turn. A famous French economist of the early 19th century named Jean-Baptiste Say is credited with Say's law. And Say's law is supply creates its own demand. Now, as a matter of historical accuracy, it seems clear that Jean-Baptiste Say never actually wrote down this law, and moreover seems clear that the law oversimplifies his beliefs. Indeed, there's sort of a running joke among academic economists that every so-called law of economics is named after someone who didn't quite believe it. But Say's law lives on as a useful shorthand for summarizing a certain point of view. How does supply create demand at the macroeconomic level? Well, each time a good or service is produced and sold, it represents income that is earned for someone. It might represent income for a worker, or a manager, or an owner, or those who are workers and managers and owners at firms that supplied inputs down the chain of production to the firm that did the actual selling. Now, of course, in individual markets, prices and wages will rise and fall depending upon microeconomic supply and demand in each market. But bottom line, from a macroeconomic point of view, every sale represents income to someone. And so, Say's law argues, a given value of supply in a macroeconomic sense must create an equivalent value of income and demand somewhere else in the economy. Now, because Jean-Baptiste Say and Adam Smith and other economists writing around the turn of the 19th century who discussed this point of view were called the classical economists, modern economists who subscribe to a version of Say's law that supply creates its own demand are typically called neoclassical economists. The main challenge for Say's law and neoclassical economics is recessions. I mean, after all, if aggregate supply always creates exactly enough aggregate demand at the macroeconomic level, then why should a recession ever happen? Why should there ever be high unemployment? Why should the economy ever contract? And just for the record, to be fair to good old Jean-Baptiste Say, he was perfectly aware of this problem, and it's one of the reasons he didn't completely believe what we now call Say's law. Even if total supply, aggregate supply in the economy, always creates an equal amount of aggregate demand, the economy could still experience a situation where some firms are earning profits and other firms are earning losses. But a recession, remember, is not a situation where business failures are being counterbalanced by an offsetting number of successes. A recession is a situation in which the whole economy is shrinking in size. Business failures heavily are outnumbering the few remaining success stories. Many firms are ending up suffering losses and laying off workers. So it's difficult to explain how if supply always creates its own demand, how an economy can get into that situation. The alternative to Say's law, with its emphasis on aggregate supply, can be named Keynes' law. And we'll call that demand creates its own supply, after the great 20th century British economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, as a matter of historical accuracy, just as Jean-Baptiste Say never wrote down anything as simple-minded as Say's law, John Maynard Keynes never wrote down anything as simple as what I'm calling Keynes' law. But the law is still a useful simplification that conveys a certain point of view. When John Maynard Keynes was writing his great work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, he pointed out that during the Depression, the capacity of the economy to supply goods and services really had not changed by much. U.S. unemployment rates were higher than 20% between 1933 and 1935. But the number of possible workers, the number of potential workers, had not increased or decreased much. In that time period, factories are closed and shuttered, but the machinery and the equipment and the potential supply from that machinery and equipment hadn't disappeared. Technologies that had been invented in the 1920s were not disinvented and forgotten in the 1930s. Thus, Keynes argued that the Great Depression, and many ordinary recessions as well, are not caused by a drop in the ability of the economy to supply goods, at least as measured by the ability to supply as measured by labor and physical capital and technology. But instead, Keynes argued, economies went into a recession because a lack of demand in the economy as a whole, a lack of aggregate demand, led to inadequate incentives for firms to produce. Keynes argued the level of GDP in the economy was thus not primarily determined by the potential of what the economy could supply, but rather by whether there was enough total demand to encourage firms to take advantage of that potential supply. In his mind, a greater amount of aggregate demand could thus call forth an increase in supply and move an economy out of a recession. What's the main conceptual challenge for Keynes' law? Well, if aggregate demand is all that matters at the macroeconomic level, then the government could make the economy as large as it wanted just by pumping up total demand through a large increase in government spending or by enormous tax cuts to push up consumption. After all, just push up demand as high as you possibly can, and if demand creates its own supply, then the result should be that you can make the economy infinitely large with infinitely large tax cuts. But economies do face genuine limits on how much they can produce at a point in time. Those genuine limits are determined by the quantity of labor and physical capital and technology, as well as by the market structures and the institutions of the economy that bring these factors of production together. These constraints on what an economy can supply at the macroeconomic level don't disappear just because there was some increase in demand. So, fundamental problem. Why don't aggregate supply and aggregate demand match up? In the short run, aggregate demand might not increase smoothly with aggregate supply for at least two reasons. One is that there can be fluctuations in business and consumer confidence, and that can cause firms and consumers to bunch their aggregate demand at certain time periods. That could cause the level of aggregate demand in the economy to fall short of potential GDP, or sometimes even to exceed potential GDP, at least in the short run. When firms are thinking about whether it's a good time to invest, they look out at the economy as a whole and they sort of think to themselves, does this look like a time when if we put in the costs of an investment, we'll get a relatively quick future payoff? Or does it look like a time when the future payoff might be deferred quite a few years, and so we should wait and do it at some point in the future? When firms are pessimistic or uncertain about the economic future, they put off their investment projects, or at least some of them, they postpone some into the future. And then when businesses think the economy is doing well and they become more optimistic, they often have a backlog of projects that they've sort of got all ready to go and all ready to start up all at once. And this is, of course, one reason why the investment component of aggregate demand is likely to surge and decline so rapidly. An example. In the second half of the 1990s, the U.S. economy experienced a wave of new information and communications technologies, including the internet, technologies that involve computing, vastly improved mobile phones. So U.S. investment levels surged at this time from about 18% of GDP in 1994 up to 21% of GDP by the year 2000. However, a recession starts in the U.S. economy in 2000, and many firms came to believe that the returns from investing in new computers and new equipment, at least for any additional investment, was not as high as they had been thinking. So U.S. investment levels quickly sank back to 18% of GDP by 2002. So this fluctuation in investment can create a situation where instead of having aggregate demand growing step by step in a smooth way with aggregate supply, aggregate demand sometimes surges and sometimes falls back. Another reason for big fluctuations in investment patterns can be tied to a nation's financial system. In the Great Depression, for example, many businesses and households were unable to repay their loans, and banks went bankrupt as a result. In fact, of 24,000 U.S. banks that were in operation in 1929, only about 14,400 banks remained in operation in 1933. Well, when so many banks went out of business, the availability of loans diminished for firms that were seeking to invest, and the availability of loans diminished for households that were seeking to buy a home or a car. When households and firms weren't able to borrow as much, aggregate demand dropped off sharply. And so this combination of financial market pressures and lack of demand helped create a situation where aggregate demand fluctuated in an extreme way, rather than sort of keeping up with aggregate supply and its slow long-term growth. If wages and prices in markets throughout the economy are often sticky, and don't adjust immediately to changes in the economy, then that's another reason why periods of shortage and surplus and unemployment can occur. Now, we talked about some of this back in the lecture on unemployment. Remember, wages are often what economists call sticky. That is, wages adjust to market conditions, but slowly. And businesses tend to avoid wage cuts because such cuts may depress morale and hurt the productivity of existing workers. They can even cause all the best workers a firm has to leave. So, when demand for a product diminishes, when there's a recession, when demand diminishes, perhaps because consumers are deciding not to buy or the financial market isn't making a lot of loans, firms don't immediately cut workers' pay. Instead, they sort of try and hold on to workers for a time and pay the same amount. Maybe they lay some workers off temporarily. So the result is unemployment and a pattern of aggregate demand that doesn't match this slow long-term growth of aggregate supply. Some modern economists have taken that theory of sticky wages and extended it to argue that it's not just wages that might be sticky in an economy, but prices as well. For example, think about many companies that publish sales catalogs, and they publish them every 6 months or every year, instead of saying, well, the price might change any given day. I mean, their prices are sticky. They're not bouncing up and down on a daily basis. The underlying issue here is that when a firm considers changing its price, it has to analyze the competition and the market demand and decide what it thinks the new price should be. It also has a lot of costs. It might need to, update sales materials, update billing records, change product labels and price labels, and also, particularly if prices are going up, it might make some important customers angry or confused. So the firm has to think about when is a good time to incur those costs of substantial price changes. These costs of changing prices, economists call them menu costs. Are like they call them menu costs because it's kind of like if a restaurant wants to change its prices, it has to print up a new set of menus. Prices do respond to forces of demand and supply. All the microeconomic stuff we learned about markets holds true, But from a macroeconomic perspective, the process of changing all the prices throughout the economy, when they're going up, when they're going down, just takes time. It doesn't always happen instantaneously. It doesn't happen overnight. And if the prices in a number of markets do not adjust quickly to equilibrium, then you're going to have periods when the price is out of equilibrium. You're going to have periods of surpluses when things are piling up on shelves throughout the economy. You're going to have other periods when people might have to wait 6 months if they want to buy a certain kind of car. You're going to have these surges of aggregate demand and declines of aggregate demand in a way where, at least in the short run, aggregate supply and aggregate demand don't match up with each other. Now, in the long run, aggregate supply does determine the size of the economy. In the long run, productive capacity is what determines how much an economy can make, and that does shape the course of the economy over time. Sure, the U.S. economy has a recession now and then, but if you look at the basic determinants, human capital, physical capital, technology, and the size of its population, the U.S. economy doesn't suddenly plummet down to, say, Mexico's standard of living and then suddenly plummet back. Instead, Say's law is roughly right in the long run. It is true that in the long run, potential GDP and aggregate supply do create the necessary demand for the economy to run at that level. But in the short run, in contrast to the long run, in the short run, aggregate demand can run a little behind or a little ahead of aggregate supply, which can lead to situations of recession or inflation. So the basic argument here is that Keynes's law is probably right in the short run, but perhaps not in the long run. One of the most famous quotations in economics, John Maynard Keynes recognized this fact. He talked about how it was true that aggregate supply ruled the long run, but aggregate demand perhaps ruled the short run. And in an essay he wrote in 1920 and 21, well before the Great Depression, Keynes wrote, "Now, in the long run, this is probably true." And in the long run, he's referring to how aggregate supply determines the output in an economy. So in the long run, Keynes wrote, this is probably true. But this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. It's a lovely metaphor, I think. It's not useful in the middle of a recession to say, well, in the long run, potential supply will make it all work out. When you're in the middle of the storm, when you're in the middle of the depression, when you're in the middle of recession, you need to do something about it at that time, even if it involves aggregate demand. So, overall, if we look at the macroeconomy, we think about how this combination of surges and drop-offs in investment, surges and drop-offs in consumption, combined together with ways in which labor markets and goods markets have sticky wages and sticky prices and are slow to adjust. And the combination of those together means, from a macroeconomic view, aggregate demand is not always going to easily match aggregate supply in the short run. Aggregate demand may be moving up and down and shifting away and toward potential GDP. Now, some economists take a neoclassical point of view. Some economists take a Keynesian view. Probably the mainstream view for the economics profession as a whole is that Keynesian statements about the importance of aggregate demand are more relevant for short-run policy, and neoclassical statements about the importance of aggregate supply are more important in the long run. But this, of course, leaves us at some level riding two horses, an aggregate supply horse and an aggregate demand horse, and trying to make them work together without a clear sense of exactly how we're supposed to bridge the gap. There's a lot of modern work in macroeconomics which is trying to sort of piece together a model which would include both the short run and the long run, but I think it's fair to say that no widely accepted model like that has yet sort of gained sway over the economics profession. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model that we've been talking about can be related to each of the four goals of macroeconomic policy: Economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and the sustainable balance of trade. So let's run through how each of these different things is taken into account. For example, how is growth of GDP and recession taken into account in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Well, economic growth is captured by the way in which aggregate supply and potential GDP gradually increase over time in the long run. On the other side, recessions occur in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model when aggregate demand falls short of potential GDP in the short run. So the model can help us think about both the long-run growth pattern and why the economy might not live up to potential GDP in the short run. How is unemployment taken into account in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Well, if aggregate demand and aggregate supply are meeting at potential GDP, so the economy is producing at its potential, then there's going to be a low rate or zero cyclical unemployment, no cyclical unemployment at all. However, for the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment will continue even if the economy is producing at potential GDP. So in a recession, if you're thinking about how to fix unemployment that happened during a recession, the logical answer is to think like a Keynesian, at least for the short term, and figure out a way to increase aggregate demand. So there's enough aggregate demand in the economy to have a derived demand for labor that will reduce cyclical unemployment down to zero. But if you're at potential GDP and the economy is producing at potential GDP, and you want to reduce unemployment, then you need to think about the natural rate of unemployment and how you might find ways to reduce that. How is inflation taken into account in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model? Well, you can get into a situation in some cases where aggregate demand exceeds potential GDP. What does that exactly mean? Well, there's a certain amount the economy can produce, and if the government really pumped a lot of demand into the economy through enormous tax cuts or through very low interest rates or just by printing money and distributing it, like the case of the magical money elves we talked about in the inflation chapter, then you can have a situation of too many dollars chasing too few goods, and inflation will result. The implication is that if a country has inflation, it needs to reduce or at least restrain the growth of aggregate demand, so that you don't have a situation where there's so much being demanded in the economy that it can't conceivably produce it all. Also, if aggregate supply experiences a negative shock, like the higher oil prices we talked about before, this can lead to a situation of inflation as well. Higher oil prices mean, or higher energy prices mean, that across the economy, many firms are facing higher prices for inputs. And those firms will want to get a higher price for their outputs too. So that as they try and pass that higher cost along, you can end up with higher inflation for the economy as a whole. What about exports and imports? Well, they don't show up directly in this model, but they come up in a lot of different ways. In terms of aggregate demand, remember that exports and imports are two of the components of aggregate demand. Exports to other countries add to aggregate demand, imports to other countries decrease aggregate demand. Sharp movements in exports and imports are going to move aggregate demand. So when we think about the balance of trade, it's clearly going to have implications for whether aggregate demand is going up or down. On the other side, in terms of aggregate supply, the balance of trade is closely linked to the national savings and investment identity that we talked about back in lecture 23. Remember that inflow of foreign investment capital because of trade deficits is one key element that determines U.S. levels of investment, that are the investment capital that's available for firms, and thus helps to determine what the U.S. rate of economic growth is going to be. Ideally, in the perfect macroeconomy, aggregate supply would steadily grow with productivity. And so there would be more investment in human capital, physical capital, and technology, and aggregate supply would steadily grow. In the meantime, aggregate demand would steadily grow based on the income being produced by that aggregate supply. And the two would march together in lockstep. So the economy was always producing at potential GDP and steadily growing with fairly low levels of inflation and fairly low levels of unemployment. But in the real world, economic growth is not a given, nor is coordination between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And that's, of course, what makes macroeconomics intellectually interesting and a real policy challenge.